Welcome to Dark Night. I'm here with you tonight, and I know many of you use these stories to drift peacefully into sleep. Before we begin our journey into the shadows, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Dark Night for more whispered tales that blend the eerie with the calming. Tonight you'll hear 3 unsettling stories while rain falls gently in the background. And this black screen will keep your mind at ease as the darkness unfolds around you. Get comfortable now. Pull your blankets close. Close your eyes. And let these voices from the void carry you into restful slumber. The night is long, but you're safe here with me. Story 1. The Midnight Caller. This story was sent to me by someone who asked to remain anonymous. They said it happened 3 years ago, but they still check their phone obsessively every night before bed. It started on a Tuesday in October. I remember because I had just moved into my first apartment after college, and I was still getting used to living alone. The place was small but cozy, a studio on the 3rd floor of an old brick building downtown. The landlord had mentioned the walls were thin, so I'd hear my neighbors sometimes, but that didn't bother me. What bothered me was the phone calls. The first one came at exactly 3:17 a.m. I know the precise time because I always keep my phone on the nightstand, and the bright screen lit up the entire dark room when it rang. The number wasn't in my contacts, just a local area code I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail, figuring it was a wrong number or maybe someone drunk dialing from a bar. But when I checked the voicemail in the morning, there was only silence. Not complete silence, I could hear something in the background. Breathing, maybe, or the sound of wind through trees. It lasted exactly 30 seconds, then ended with a soft click. I deleted it and forgot about it. People get wrong numbers all the time. The second call came exactly 24 hours later. Same time, 3:17 a.m. Same unknown number. This time I was annoyed enough to answer. "Hello?" I whispered, trying not to wake my neighbors. Nothing. Just that same background sound like wind or maybe distant traffic. But there was something else now. Something I hadn't noticed in the voicemail. A rhythmic tapping, soft but persistent like fingernails on glass. "Hello? Who is this?" I said a little louder, still nothing. After about a minute, the line went dead. I tried calling the number back immediately, but it went straight to a generic voicemail message, the kind the phone company sets up automatically. No personal greeting, no name, just a robotic voice saying the person at this number was unavailable. By the 3rd night, I was expecting it. I actually lay awake, staring at my phone, waiting for 3:17 to appear on the screen. And right on schedule, it rang. This time I answered immediately without saying hello. I just listened. The background sounds were clearer now, and I realized it wasn't wind or traffic. It was whispering. Multiple voices, too quiet to make out words, but definitely human. They rose and fell in a rhythm that reminded me of prayer or chanting. And underneath it all, that persistent tapping continued. I stayed on the line for nearly 5 minutes, just listening, trying to understand what I was hearing. The whispering never got louder, never became clear enough to understand, but it never stopped either. It was hypnotic in a deeply unsettling way. Finally, I hung up. The 4th night, I decided to record the call. I had an old digital recorder from college that I used for interviews when I worked at the campus newspaper. I set it up next to my phone and waited. AM came and went. No call. I felt oddly disappointed, even though I knew I should have been relieved. I had gotten so accustomed to the routine that its absence felt wrong somehow, like a clock that suddenly stops ticking. You don't notice the sound until it's gone. But at 3:33 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text message. "Same unknown number. You were expecting me." My blood went cold. I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Who is this?" The response came immediately. "Check your window." I lived on the 3rd floor. There was a fire escape outside my window, but you'd have to climb up from the alley to reach it. I crept to the window and peered through the blinds. The alley was empty, just trash cans and the dim glow of a streetlight at the far end. But as I watched, I noticed something strange. The shadows seemed to be moving independently of anything that should cast them. They shifted and swirled like smoke, darker than the surrounding darkness. My phone buzzed again. I can see you. I jerked away from the window and grabbed my phone to call 911, but before I could dial, another message appeared. Don't. We're just talking. Then the phone rang. I didn't want to answer, but something compelled me to. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe fear, or maybe something else entirely. I picked up the phone. Hello, Sarah. It was the first time the caller had spoken actual words, and hearing my name in that voice, soft, almost gentle, but with an undertone like distant thunder, made my knees weak. The voice was neither clearly male nor female, and it had an odd quality, like it was coming from very far away. How do you know my name? I whispered. I know many things about you, Sarah. I know you moved here from Portland. I know you graduated with a degree in journalism. I know you're afraid of spiders but not snakes. I know you call your mother every Sunday at 2 p.m. All of that was true, but none of it was particularly secret information. Anyone could have found it out with some basic research. What do you want? I asked. I want to tell you a story, the voice said. Will you listen? Every instinct told me to hang up, to call the police, to run. But there was something about the voice, despite its unsettling quality, that was almost soothing, like a parent telling a bedtime story. Okay, I heard myself say. Once upon a time, the voice began, there was a girl who lived alone in a tall building. She thought she was safe there, high above the ground with locks on her door and lights in her windows. But safety is an illusion, Sarah. The things that hunt in the dark don't need doors or windows. They don't need to climb fire escapes or pick locks. I was gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles were white. This girl received phone calls in the night, the voice continued. Strange calls from unknown numbers. She thought they were random, meaningless. But nothing is random, Sarah. Everything has a purpose. The calls were an invitation. An invitation to what? To join us. To stop pretending that your little apartment, your little life, your little fears matter in the grand scheme of things. To acknowledge that you've always known, deep down, that you're being watched. That you're not alone. That you've never been alone. The voice was right about one thing. I had always felt watched. Even as a child, I'd had the sensation that something was observing me, especially in the dark. I'd blamed it on an overactive imagination, on too many scary movies, on anything except the possibility that it might be real. I don't understand, I said. You will. Tomorrow night at 3:17, go to your window. Look down at the alley. You'll see us then. You'll see that we've always been there, waiting for you to notice, waiting for you to be ready. Ready for what? But the line had gone dead. I spent the next day in a fog of anxiety and confusion. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That someone was making strange phone calls and sending cryptic text messages? That I felt like I was being watched? They'd probably think I was having some kind of breakdown. I thought about staying at a hotel for the night or calling a friend to come stay with me. But something held me back. A morbid curiosity, maybe, or a feeling that running away wouldn't solve anything. If this person, or whatever they were, knew so much about me, they'd probably just find me wherever I went. So I stayed. I spent the evening researching the phone number online, trying to find any trace of who it belonged to. But there was nothing. No records, no social media profiles, no business listings. It was as if the number existed in a void. As 3:17 approached, I positioned myself by the window with my phone in hand. I had 911 pre-dialed, my finger hovering over the call button. At exactly 3:17, my phone rang. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Are you at the window? The voice asked without preamble. Yes. Look down. I peered through the blinds into the alley below. At first, I saw nothing unusual. The same trash cans, the same dim streetlight, the same shadows. But as I watched, the shadows began to move again. Only this time, they weren't just shifting aimlessly. They were forming shapes. Human shapes. Do you see us, Sarah? I could make out at least a dozen figures standing in the alley, perfectly still, all facing up toward my window. They were too far away and too shrouded in darkness for me to make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on me like a physical weight. "Who are you?" I whispered. "We are the ones who watch, the ones who wait, the ones who call out in the night to those who are ready to listen. You've been chosen, Sarah. You've been chosen because you're like us. I'm not like you. I don't even know what you are. You're alone, Sarah. You've always been alone. Even in crowded rooms, even with friends and family around you, you feel that isolation, don't you? That sense that you're fundamentally separate from everyone else, that you're observing life rather than living it." The voice was right, and that terrified me more than anything else it had said. I had always felt like an outsider, like I was watching the world through glass, unable to truly connect with the people around me. That feeling isn't a flaw, Sarah. It's a gift. It means you can see things others can't, feel things others don't. You're a natural observer, a watcher, like us. I looked down at the figures in the alley. They were still motionless, still staring up at me. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing you're not ready to give. We just wanted you to know we're here. We wanted you to know that you're not as alone as you think. When you're ready, truly ready, you'll know how to find us, and if I'm never ready..." There was a long pause before the voice answered. "Everyone gets lonely enough eventually, Sarah. Everyone reaches a point where the isolation becomes unbearable. When that happens, remember this conversation. Remember that there are others like you. Remember that you always have a choice." The line went quiet, but I could hear the background sounds again, that soft whispering, that rhythmic tapping. And now I could hear something else, footsteps. Slow, measured footsteps like people walking in formation. I looked down at the alley. The figures were dispersing, melting back into the shadows they had emerged from. Within moments, the alley was empty again. The phone was still connected, but silent. Finally, I heard the voice one last time, so quiet I almost missed it. "Sweet dreams, Sarah." Then the line went dead. That was 3 years ago. The calls stopped after that night, and I never saw the figures in the alley again. I moved to a different apartment 6 months later, partly because I never felt safe there anymore, but mostly because I was afraid of what might happen if I stayed. But I still think about that voice sometimes, especially on nights when the loneliness feels overwhelming. I still wonder who or what those figures were. And sometimes when I'm lying in bed in the early hours of the morning, I find myself listening for the phone to ring, because the voice was right about one thing. Everyone gets lonely enough eventually, and I'm starting to wonder if I'm ready to not be alone anymore. If you're listening now, where are you from? What time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know who's joining me in these dark hours. Mine now. Let's slip into our next tale, one that comes from the deep woods where cell towers can't reach, and civilization feels like a distant memory. Story 2, The Cabin with No Name. This story was shared with me by a park ranger named David, who worked in the Montana wilderness for over 15 years before he retired early. He said he's never told this story to anyone outside his family, but something about the long nights and the way shadows dance in firelight made him feel like it needed to be heard. It happened during my 3rd year as a ranger, when I was still eager to prove myself and took on the assignments nobody else wanted. The call came in on a gray October morning. Hikers overdue, last known location somewhere near Whitefish Creek, about 20 miles into the backcountry. Their vehicle was still at the trailhead, keys locked inside, and they'd missed their check-in with family by 2 days. Search and rescue was my specialty, so I volunteered to head out alone for the initial sweep. Protocol usually required at least 2 rangers, but we were short-staffed, and I was cocky enough to think I could handle anything the mountains threw at me. I packed for 3 days, loaded my GPS with waypoints, and headed out before dawn. The trail to Whitefish Creek was well marked for the first 10 miles, then branched into several smaller paths that wound deeper into the wilderness. The missing hikers, a couple from Seattle named Marcus and Janet Hayes, had filed a backcountry permit for the northern branch, which led to some spectacular overlooks, but also some of the most remote country in the park. The weather was perfect, crisp and clear with that sharp autumn air that makes every breath feel like it's cleaning your lungs. I made good time for the first few hours, following the creek upstream and calling out the hikers' names every few hundred yards. No response, but that wasn't unusual. Sound travels strangely in the mountains, and they could have been just over the next ridge. Around noon, I found their first campsite. It was exactly where it should have been according to their permit, about 12 miles in from the trailhead. The site was clean, too clean. No trash, no forgotten gear, no sign they'd even built a fire. But the ground showed clear evidence that a tent had been pitched there, and I found a few boot prints that matched the description of their hiking boots. According to their plan, they should have spent 2 nights here, then moved on to a higher elevation camp near Sentinel Peak. I followed the trail north, climbing steadily through stands of pine and aspen that were just starting to turn gold. That's when I found the first strange thing. About 2 miles up from their campsite, I came across a cabin that wasn't on any of my maps. I knew this area well. I'd hiked these trails dozens of times, and I was certain there had never been a structure here before. It was small, maybe 12 feet square, built from rough-hewn logs that looked old but not weathered. No windows, just a heavy wooden door with a simple latch. The thing that struck me immediately was how perfect it looked. Like it had been built yesterday but designed to look ancient. The logs fit together with the kind of precision you'd expect from a master craftsman, not some hermit's wilderness shack. And there was no debris around it. No sawdust, no leftover materials, no path leading to or from it. It just sat there in a small clearing as if it had grown from the earth. I should have marked the location and reported it when I got back. Unauthorized structures in the park were a serious issue, and this one was clearly recent despite its appearance. But I was focused on finding the missing hikers, and I figured I'd deal with the cabin later. I circled the structure, looking for any sign that Marcus and Janet had been there. No footprints, no disturbed ground, nothing. The door was latched from the outside, suggesting no one was currently inside. But something made me hesitate to open it. Maybe it was the way the cabin seemed to absorb sound. Even my footsteps seemed muted when I got close to it. I called out, "Hello? Anyone in there?" "This is the Park Service." No response. But as I stood there listening, I could have sworn I heard something from inside. Not voices or movement exactly, but a sound like settling. Like the cabin was adjusting itself around something. I should have opened that door. That's what I was trained to do. But something about the place made my skin crawl. And I convinced myself that if the hikers had been there, there would be some sign outside. I moved on, following the trail toward Sentinel Peak. The second strange thing happened about an hour later. I was climbing a steep section through a grove of old-growth pines when I noticed that my GPS was acting up. The signal kept cutting in and out, which was unusual for that area. I'd used GPS there before without problems. But more concerning was that according to the device, I was walking in circles. The screen showed my track as a tight spiral, even though I knew I'd been following a straight trail uphill for the past hour. I stopped and tried to recalibrate, but the GPS kept insisting I was moving in the same small area, about 50 yards in diameter. I switched to compass navigation and kept climbing. The trail was still clear, still heading in the right direction according to my compass, but I started noticing things that didn't make sense. Trees I was certain I'd already passed, rock formations I remembered from earlier. A distinctive lightning-struck pine that I could have sworn I'd seen 20 minutes ago. I told myself it was just fatigue and the similarity of mountain terrain playing tricks on my mind. In thick forest, everything can start to look the same after a while. But when I came around a bend and saw the cabin again, I knew something was seriously wrong. It was the same cabin, same logs, same door, same clearing. But according to my compass, I'd been walking north for over an hour. There was no way I could have circled back to the same location. This time I approached more cautiously. I took photos with my digital camera, including shots of the GPS reading and the compass bearing. I wanted documentation of whatever was happening here. The cabin looked exactly the same as before, but now I noticed details I'd missed. The door latch was made from what looked like bone. Not carved bone, but an actual piece of bone, maybe from a large animal, worn smooth and fitted perfectly to the wooden door. And there were symbols carved into the log above the door frame. Not words or letters in any language I recognized, but geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when I looked at them directly. I tried my radio, but it was only static. Cell phone had no signal, which was expected this far out. I was completely cut off from communication. Standing there in front of that impossible cabin, I realized I had two choices. I could turn around and try to find my way back to familiar territory, or I could open that door and find out what was inside. Both options terrified me, but leaving felt like abandoning Marcus and Janet if they were somehow connected to this place. I reached for the door latch. The bone was warm to the touch, which made no sense in the cool mountain air. As I lifted the latch, I could hear that settling sound again, louder now, like the cabin was breathing. The door swung open on silent hinges. Inside, the cabin was bigger than it should have been. The interior walls were at least 20 feet apart, even though the outside of the structure couldn't have been more than 12 feet square. The floor was packed earth, and the walls were lined with shelves holding objects I couldn't immediately identify in the dim light filtering through the doorway. But what caught my attention first was the smell. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was old, ancient even, like the scent of stone caves or deep forest loam, but with an undertone of something organic and complex that I couldn't place. I stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind me with a soft click. I spun around and pushed against it, but the door wouldn't budge. The latch on the inside was a different piece of bone. This one longer and more curved, and no matter how I manipulated it, the door stayed firmly closed. That's when panic really set in. I used my flashlight to examine the interior more carefully, looking for another way out or some clue about what this place was. The shelves held an assortment of objects that seemed to have no connection to each other. Old books with blank pages, glass jars filled with what looked like preserved plants, pieces of metal worked into shapes I didn't recognize, and dozens of small wooden boxes, each one sealed with wax. But in the back corner, I found something that made my blood freeze, a backpack, modern, expensive, the kind serious hikers use for multi-day trips. I opened it and found identification. Marcus Hayes, Seattle, Washington, so they had been here. I searched through the pack. Most of their gear was there, camping equipment, food, extra clothes, but no sign of Marcus or Janet themselves, and no indication of where they might have gone or what had happened to them. As I was going through their belongings, I heard voices outside, muffled, indistinct voices, like people having a conversation just beyond the walls. I pressed my ear to the log wall and could make out what sounded like a man and a woman talking, but I couldn't understand the words. The language didn't sound like English or like any language I'd ever heard. Marcus, Janet, I called out. The voices stopped immediately. I waited, listening, but heard only silence. Then, after what felt like several minutes, the voices resumed. This time they sounded closer, like they were right outside the cabin walls. I could hear the cadence and rhythm of conversation, but the actual words remained incomprehensible. I tried the door again, pushing and pulling with all my strength, but it refused to move. I examined every inch of the interior walls, looking for a window or another exit, but found nothing. The cabin was completely sealed except for the door, which seemed to be locked from the outside now. Hours passed. I had no way to judge time accurately since my watch had stopped working. The hands were spinning slowly but continuously, never settling on any particular time. The voices outside came and went, sometimes seeming to move around the cabin in slow circles, sometimes stopping directly outside the door. I tried to sleep, but every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something that jerked me awake. Footsteps on the roof, scratching sounds on the walls, and once, unmistakably, someone trying the door latch from the outside. When morning came, or what I assumed was morning, since light began filtering under the door, the voices stopped. I heard footsteps moving away from the cabin, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. Then suddenly, the door swung open. I didn't waste time trying to understand why. I grabbed Marcus's backpack and my own gear and rushed outside, expecting to see Marcus and Janet, or whoever had been talking outside the cabin. But the clearing was empty. More than empty, it looked like it had never been disturbed. No footprints, no sign that anyone had ever been there except for my own tracks leading to and from the cabin door. I checked my compass and GPS. Both were working perfectly now, and according to their readings, I was exactly where I should be, about 3 miles north of where I'd found the first campsite, right on the trail to Sentinel Peak. I looked back at the cabin, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw faces in the spaces between the logs. Pale faces with dark eyes watching me from inside the walls themselves. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing. I documented everything I could, took more photos, made detailed notes, collected GPS coordinates. Then I hiked out as fast as I could without running. When I reached the trailhead, I found Marcus and Janet Hayes sitting in their car, very much alive and apparently confused about why I was looking for them. "We've been worried about you," Marcus said when he saw me. "When you didn't come back yesterday, we were about to call for help." I stared at them. "Yesterday? You've been missing for 3 days." They looked at each other with the kind of expression people get when they think they're dealing with someone who's lost touch with reality. "We got back 2 days ago," Janet said gently. "We finished our hike a day early because of the weather forecast. We left a message with the ranger station, but maybe it didn't get through." I checked my own records. According to my notes, I'd been in the backcountry for 1 day, not 3. According to the calendar on my camera, the photos of the cabin were taken on the same day I'd started the search. But I remembered every hour of those 3 days in vivid detail. When I got back to the station, I checked the logs. There was no record of Marcus and Janet Hayes ever being reported missing. Their backcountry permit had been properly closed out, and there was no search and rescue operation listed in the daily reports. But I still had Marcus's backpack. I never told my supervisors about the cabin or what had happened. I tried to return the backpack to Marcus, but when I called the contact number from their permit, I got a disconnected message. When I tried to look them up online, I found no trace of anyone named Marcus or Janet Hayes in Seattle or anywhere else. The backpack is still in my garage. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I go through it again looking for some clue that might explain what happened. The gear is all real, quality hiking equipment, well used but well maintained. But there are no personal items, no photographs, no anything that would prove these people actually existed. I went back to look for the cabin 3 times over the next year. I followed my GPS coordinates exactly, used the photos to identify landmarks, even brought other rangers with me. But we never found it again. According to every map and survey, there's never been any structure in that area. The thing is, I still hear those voices sometimes, not often, and never clearly enough to understand what they're saying. But on quiet nights, especially when I'm alone in the wilderness, I catch fragments of that same strange conversation carried on the wind. And sometimes, I wonder if Marcus and Janet Hayes are still out there somewhere, in a place that exists between the spaces on our maps, having the same conversation over and over again, waiting for the next person to find their way to a cabin that shouldn't exist. I retired early from the Park Service. Officially, it was due to a minor injury, but the truth is that I couldn't handle being alone in the wilderness anymore. Every cabin, every abandoned structure, every place where the GPS signal gets spotty makes me think of that impossible room and those voices in the dark. But the worst part isn't the fear or the confusion or the way reality seemed to bend around that place. The worst part is that sometimes, late at night when the world is very quiet, I find myself missing it, missing the mystery, The sense that there were things in the world beyond my understanding, missing the feeling that I'd glimpsed something profound and terrifying and beautiful, even if I couldn't begin to comprehend what it was. And sometimes I think about going back to look for it again. Story 3. The Night Shift at Willow Grove. This final story comes from someone who worked security at a nursing home. She asked me not to use her real name, so I'll call her Elena. She said this happened during her last week on the job, and it's the reason she'll never work night security again. I took the job at Willow Grove Assisted Living because the pay was decent and the work seemed easy. Night security at a nursing home, how hard could it be? Most of the residents would be asleep, and all I had to do was walk the halls every hour, check the doors, and make sure everything was secure. Willow Grove was an older facility, built in the 1960s as a hospital, before being converted into senior housing in the late 80s. The architecture had that institutional feel. Long corridors with polished linoleum floors, fluorescent lighting, and that particular smell of industrial disinfectant that never quite masks the underlying odors of age and medication. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and for the first few months it was exactly as boring as I'd expected. I'd make my rounds, read books at the security desk, and occasionally help a nurse with a restless resident. The most excitement I usually saw was when Mr. Patterson in room 237 would get confused and try to leave in the middle of the night, thinking he was late for work at a job he'd retired from 20 years earlier. The building had 3 floors. The ground floor housed the administrative offices, kitchen, and common areas. The second floor was for residents who needed minimal assistance, people who were mostly independent but wanted the security of having help nearby. The third floor was for residents with more serious health issues, including the memory care unit for patients with dementia and Alzheimer's. I rarely had reason to go to the third floor during my rounds. The nurses up there handled any issues that arose, and the elevator required a key card that I wasn't supposed to use unless there was an emergency. But about 6 months into the job, things started to change. It began with the elevator. Every night around 2 a.m., I'd hear the elevator moving. The motors were old and loud, so you could hear them clearly from anywhere on the first 2 floors. I'd watch the floor indicator above the elevator doors, and it would always show the same pattern. Up to the 3rd floor, pause for a few minutes, then back down to the ground floor. At first, I assumed it was just the night nurses going up to check on the memory care patients. But when I asked Martha, the head night nurse, about it, she looked puzzled. "We don't use the elevator at night unless it's an emergency," she said. "The memory care unit has its own nursing station, and those nurses stay on the 3rd floor for their entire shift. They wouldn't have any reason to come down here." I started paying closer attention. The elevator ran at exactly 2:17 a.m. every night like clockwork. And when it returned to the ground floor, the doors would open for about 30 seconds, then close again. But I never saw anyone get on or off. After a week of this, I decided to investigate. On a quiet Tuesday night, I positioned myself near the elevator at 2:15 a.m. and waited. Right on schedule, I heard the motors engage and watched the floor indicator climb to 3. I pressed the call button for the elevator, thinking I'd ride up with it when it came back down and see what was happening on the 3rd floor. The elevator descended and the doors opened. It was empty, but as I stepped inside, I noticed something strange. The elevator had that same institutional smell as the rest of the building, but there was something else underneath it. Something organic and sweet, like flowers left too long in water. I pressed the button for the 3rd floor. The elevator rose smoothly and the doors opened onto a corridor that looked identical to the floors below. Same linoleum, same fluorescent lighting, same beige walls. But something felt different. The air was cooler, and there was a quality to the silence that reminded me of being underwater. The nursing station was at the far end of the hall, and I could see light coming from it, but no movement. I walked toward it, my footsteps echoing strangely in the empty corridor. "Hello?" I called out softly, not wanting to wake any of the residents. No response. As I got closer to the nursing station, I realized that what I'd thought was light from inside was actually light reflecting off empty windows. The station was deserted. I checked the schedule posted on the wall. According to the chart, there should have been 2 nurses on duty, Patricia Hendricks and James Morton. But their names meant nothing to me, and I'd never seen them during shift changes. I was starting to feel uneasy, but I told myself there was probably a simple explanation. Maybe they were in with a patient or taking a break in one of the other rooms. I decided to do a quick walk through the hall to make sure everything was secure, then head back downstairs. The memory care unit occupied the entire 3rd floor, with about 40 residents in private and semi-private rooms. As I walked past the doors, I could hear the usual sounds of sleep. Soft breathing, occasional snoring, the rustle of sheets. Everything seemed normal, but when I reached room 314, I stopped. The door was slightly ajar and I could see light coming from inside. Not the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway, but a softer, warmer glow, like candlelight. I knocked gently on the doorframe. "Hello, is everything okay in there?" I heard a voice from inside, an elderly woman speaking quietly. "Come in, dear. I've been waiting for you." I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was identical to all the others I'd seen during orientation. A hospital bed, a small dresser, a chair by the window. But it felt different somehow, more lived in, more personal than the sterile rooms I was used to seeing. An elderly woman was sitting in the chair by the window, facing away from me. She had long gray hair that caught the strange light, and she was wearing what looked like a vintage nightgown, the kind with lace trim and pearl buttons. "Mrs." I glanced at the nameplate by the door. "Mrs. Whitmore?" "Sit down, Elena," she said without turning around. "We have much to discuss." Hearing my name from a resident I'd never met before should have been alarming, but something about her voice was so calm and gentle that I found myself moving toward the other chair in the room. "How do you know my name?" I asked as I sat down. "I know many things," she said, still facing the window. "I know you've been watching the elevator. I know you've been wondering about the sounds you hear at night. I know you're starting to question whether this place is what it seems to be." She was right about all of that, but I didn't see how she could have known about my observations of the elevator, or my growing sense that something was off about the night shift. "Are you the one who's been using the elevator?" I asked. She laughed softly. "Oh dear, no. I haven't left this room in quite some time, but I've been watching you through the window and I thought it was time we had a conversation." I looked toward the window she was facing. From the 3rd floor you could see the parking lot and the street beyond, but at this time of night there was nothing to see except the occasional passing car. "What did you want to talk about?" I asked. "About the nature of time, Elena. About the way some places exist outside the normal flow of hours and days. About what happens when the boundary between then and now become permeable." I was starting to feel like I was in over my head. But something about Mrs. Whitmore's presence was oddly comforting, even as her words were becoming increasingly strange. "I don't understand," I said. "Willow Grove has been many things over the years," she continued. "A hospital, as you know. Before that, it was a private sanitarium. And before that, in the 1920s, it was a boarding house for young women who worked in the textile mills downtown. I knew about the hospital history, but the rest was news to me. Many people have lived and died in this building, Elena. And sometimes, when there have been enough strong emotions in a place, enough joy and sorrow, enough hope and despair, the building itself begins to remember. Remember what? Everything. Every conversation, every moment of happiness, every instance of loss. The walls absorb it all, and sometimes, under the right conditions, those memories bleed through. I was beginning to think that Mrs. Whitmore might be experiencing some kind of dementia-related confusion, mixing reality with imagination. But her voice remained clear and lucid, and there was something about the way she spoke that suggested deep understanding rather than confusion. The elevator, I said. What does that have to do with memories? The elevator is like a conductor, you might say. It moves between different layers of time that exist in this building. When you ride it at 2:17 a.m., you're not just moving between floors. You're moving between eras. That was clearly impossible, but I found myself asking, what era am I in now? For the first time since I'd entered the room, Mrs. Whitmore turned to look at me. Her face was kind but ancient, lined with wrinkles that spoke of decades of experience, but her eyes were strange. They seemed to be looking at me and through me at the same time, as if she was seeing multiple versions of me simultaneously. Right now, you're in 1987, she said, the year this building was converted from a hospital to a nursing home. I was one of the first residents here, and I've been in this room ever since. But it's 2019, I said, is it? She smiled gently. What year did you think it was when you started working here? I opened my mouth to answer, then realized I wasn't entirely sure. The job application process felt like a blur, and I couldn't remember specific dates or conversations with my supervisor. Even my training period seemed vague and dreamlike. Time moves differently here at night, Mrs. Whitmore continued. The day shift exists in the present, but when the sun goes down and the building settles into quiet, we slip into the past. Every night we relive moments from the building's history. Sometimes we're in the 1980s when this was still transitioning from hospital to nursing home. Sometimes we drift back to the 1940s when it was a hospital treating wounded soldiers. And sometimes we go all the way back to the 1920s when young women would gather in the common rooms downstairs to share their hopes and dreams. That's impossible, I said. But even as I spoke the words, I was remembering things that didn't quite make sense. The elevator that always ran at the same time. The residents I'd seen during my rounds who never seemed to age or change. The way my supervisor always seemed vague when I asked about schedules or policies. Is it impossible, Elena? Or is it just something you haven't experienced before? I stood up from my chair, suddenly feeling the need to get back to familiar territory. I should get back to my rounds. Of course, Mrs. Whitmore said. But before you go, I want you to understand something. You're not trapped here. You can leave anytime you want. The day shift, the world outside these walls, that's all still there, waiting for you. But if you choose to stay and work the night shift, you become part of the building's memory, part of its story. What does that mean? It means you'll help other people who find themselves lost between times. You'll be a guide, a friendly face, a source of comfort for those who are confused by the way past and present blend together here. It's important work, Elena. Not everyone is suited for it, but I think you might be. I walked to the door, then turned back to look at her. How do I know if any of this is real? Ask yourself this, she said. When was the last time you saw sunlight? When was the last time you spoke to someone outside this building? When was the last time you looked at a calendar and knew for certain what day it was? I tried to remember and realized I couldn't. My life outside of Willow Grove felt distant and hazy, like something I'd dreamed rather than lived. The choice is yours, Mrs. Whitmore said, but choose carefully. Once you fully accept the nature of this place, once you stop fighting the way time moves here, you become anchored to it. You become part of what helps others navigate the confusion of existing between then and now. I left room 314 and walked back toward the elevator, my mind reeling. Everything Mrs. Whitmore had said felt both impossible and completely true. As I waited for the elevator, I noticed that the hallway looked different than it had when I'd first arrived. The walls seemed older, the paint more faded, and the smell in the air had changed to something more medicinal, more institutional. When the elevator arrived and I stepped inside, I saw that there were buttons for floors I hadn't noticed before. Not just 1, 2, and 3, but buttons labeled B for basement, and even one marked with a symbol I didn't recognize. I pressed 1 for the ground floor. When the doors opened, I stepped out into a version of the lobby that looked like it was from several decades earlier. The furniture was different, older, more formal, and the lighting was dimmer. There were people in the waiting area, but they were dressed in clothing from what looked like the 1940s or 1950s. They sat quietly, some reading newspapers with headlines I couldn't quite make out, others simply staring into space with the patient expression of people who had been waiting for a very long time. None of them looked at me as I walked past. I made my way to the security desk, which was where it had always been but looked different now, older, more worn. The logbook was still there, but when I opened it, the entries were written in different handwriting and dated from years I knew couldn't be right. Spent the rest of that night moving through different versions of Willow Grove. Sometimes I'd take the elevator and find myself in what seemed to be the 1960s, when the building was still a hospital. I'd walk past rooms where doctors in white coats were making rounds, their voices echoing in the corridors as they discussed treatments and prognoses for patients whose illnesses belonged to a different era. Other times, I'd find myself in what must have been the 1920s boarding house Mrs. Whitmore had mentioned. The hallways would be filled with the sounds of young women getting ready for work, the click of heels on hardwood floors, the murmur of conversations about boys and jobs and dreams of better lives. But no matter what era I found myself in, there were always people who seemed to be from my own time, night shift workers like me moving through the building with the same confused but accepting expression I was beginning to recognize in myself. They nodded when our paths crossed, acknowledging our shared experience without the need for words. As dawn approached, the building began to settle back into what I now understood was the present day. The anachronistic furniture faded, the vintage-dressed visitors in the lobby disappeared, and the hallways returned to their familiar fluorescent-lit sterility. But I was different. I understood now why the job had felt so dreamlike, why my memories of the outside world seemed vague and distant. Willow Grove wasn't just a nursing home. It was a repository of time itself, a place where the past continued to exist alongside the present, and where sensitive people could slip between eras as easily as taking an elevator between floors. Mrs. Whitmore had been right about the choice. I could leave if I wanted to. I could walk out the front door and return to whatever life I'd had before, though I suspected that life would feel increasingly unreal compared to the profound strangeness of this place. Or I could stay and become one of the guardians of this impossible space, helping others navigate the confusion of existing between then and now, offering comfort and understanding to those who found themselves lost in time. I stayed. That was 3 years ago, though time doesn't work quite the same way for me anymore. I still work the night shift at Willow Grove, and I still make my rounds through the building's many eras. I've become friends with the other time-displaced workers, and I've learned to find my way through decades of history with the same confidence I once felt navigating normal space. Sometimes new people join the night shift, looking confused and frightened by experiences they can't explain. When that happens, I try to be for them what Mrs. Whitmore was for me, a calm voice in the darkness, someone who can help them understand that they're not going crazy, they're just experiencing something most people never get to see. And every night at 2:17 a.m., I ride the elevator through time, checking on the residents of Willow Grove across all the years they've called this place home. I've learned that the building's memory isn't just about preserving the past. It's about providing comfort and continuity, ensuring that no one who lived and loved and suffered here is ever truly forgotten. Mrs. Whitmore is still in room 314, though I've learned that she died in 1987, shortly after the building became a nursing home. But death, like time, works differently at Willow Grove. She continues to welcome new arrivals, to explain the nature of the place, and to help people make the choice between returning to linear time or accepting the strange gift of existing between moments. If you ever find yourself working a night shift in a place that feels more alive than it should, if you notice that time doesn't seem to flow quite right, if you hear elevators moving when no one should be using them, pay attention. You might be in a place like Willow Grove, a place where the past reaches out to touch the present, and where the boundary between then and now is as thin as a whisper. And if that happens, remember that you always have a choice. But choose carefully, because some doors once opened change everything about the way you see the world. That's all for tonight's journey into the dark. 3 tales of things that exist just beyond the edge of understanding. Phone calls from the void, cabins that bend reality, and places where time itself becomes fluid. If you have a story of your own, something that happened to you in the quiet hours when the world feels different, send it to Dark Knight and maybe I'll share it here in the shadows. Make sure you're subscribed for more whispered tales and turn on notifications so you never miss our next descent into mystery. Until then, sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with wonder rather than fear. The night watches over us all. Upper